Welcome to today's event, COVID-Induced Crises and Refugee Women's Livelihoods with international human rights activist Wai Wai Nu. Wai Wai Nu is a former political prisoner and the founder and executive director of Women Peace Network in Myanmar. She spent 7 years as a political prisoner in Myanmar, and since her release from prison in 2012, has dedicated herself to working for democracy and human rights. Through the Women Peace Network, Wai Wai Nu is building peace and mutual understanding between Myanmar's ethnic communities and works to empower and advocate the rights of marginalized women throughout Myanmar, and particularly in Rakhine State. Her work also aims to improve the human rights of Rohingya people through documentation, convenings, and policy advocacy among key leaders in Myanmar and high-level international fora. Our conversation will be moderated by postdoctoral fellow Shay Friedland, who received her PhD in human geography from the University of Colorado, Boulder. Dr. Friedland is a feminist geographer concerned with the translocal political economy of forced displacement and has conducted extensive research on gender and labor in the Rohingya diaspora. Thank you both again for taking the time to be here today, and I'll turn the floor over to you, Shay.
Thank you so much, LaShawn. Globally, over 3 million people have died of COVID-19. Human movement came to a standstill. Industries went bankrupt, lives were upended, and whole countries were demonized. How has this experience been unique for refugees generally and displaced women in particular? What have been their experiences, and how has their precarity or insecurity been compounded during this pandemic? Speaking from her own experiences, Wai Wai Nu will focus on the impacts of COVID-19 on refugee and internally displaced women in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Thailand. She will reflect on displaced women's experiences of life during the pandemic and how COVID-19 has impacted their work, health, and housing access. She will also identify how displaced women have overcome these challenges, as well as the opportunities for transformation that have come with the pandemic. Finally, she will provide recommendations for improving refugee and internally displaced women's access to dignified work, healthcare, and housing in cities across the global South and worldwide. It is my great honor to welcome Wai Wai Nu to Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania and to invite her to share her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Shay and Perry World House for this opportunity. I had an honor of working with you, Dr. Shay, on a report we came up with. We had a nice travel visit to the refugee camps 3 years ago, in documenting the life of women, especially the sexual survivors in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and working on this report called several reports, and including a report came out by my organization's Women's Peace Network, the Rakhine. We used to have picnic together, a Rakhine report on women's memories and livelihood before the conflict. So today again, I'm honored and privileged to join you here on this special event. My remark today will be based on my experience and working and coordinating with many women in refugee camps and IDP camps across Asia, particularly in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, and in Thailand, and in Malaysia. So as we all know, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic did not discriminate or does not discriminate when it affects in terms of infections, and the COVID itself does not discriminate people. However, the impact of the COVID-19 has been disproportionately affecting to some groups, especially the refugees and IDPs. Displaced persons are the most vulnerable groups among them. Even among the refugees and IDPs, the displaced disabled people, elderlies, and women are highly affected by this, uniquely affected by this COVID-19. I'm gonna lay out some common effect of the impact of the COVID-19 on the women, as well as some unique challenges of the COVID-19 of women in different displaced communities or countries. Some of the commonality that we were able to observe are that first of all, many this whether displaced or the refugee women's, a lot of them were before working non-formally in different sector, INGOs to other non-formal like work or non-formal activities they are engaging with, including teaching students, teaching kids. All of those work has been substantially decreased or stopped. So basically, like men, a lot of these women were lost their job, and thus, the consequences as a result, they continue to face the income challenges and the stress like men. However, when they try to return to those work, it's become extremely challenging for women to get access to those work back. And the second commonality that we find is access to, like, decreasing access to women-friendly spaces. So in the past, women, when they have challenges especially in the refugee camps, like in Bangladesh, these refugees are the survivors from severe armed conflicts, or in the case of Bangladesh, they are genocide survivors. So they used to have these places run by the UN Women or other organizations in the camp, which call the women-friendly spaces. So they often go there and talk among each other to de-stress or to overcome their challenges and as such. So when pandemic hit, all these women-friendly spaces has stopped. So it's become additional burden and for them not to be able to communicate with fellow women's friends and to share their challenges and to basically have a society, so have a social group community for themselves. And it's across the different countries in Myanmar or in Bangladesh or in Thailand or elsewhere. And the third form of commonality that we were able to observe is the increase in domestic violence, as both women and men lost their job and reduced income, and men, the increase of domestic violence, according to that data from the UN Women, if I am not wrong, shows that the domestic violence has increased up to 60% in the refugee camps. So basically, it's extremely, in addition to the existing stress, the domestic violence has actually increased, put them in a more vulnerable situations. And oftentimes these domestic violence are considered a private matter and family matter. Also, therefore, we can assume that the reporting of the domestic violence and the data that even available out there might not reflect the actual rate of domestic violence. So increase in domestic violence it's become a really a major challenge for women across the different displaced person camps and refugee camps. In some cases, we're even able to identify that the men leave them for remarrying or different after this the severe form of the domestic violences, and it's been disheartening to see. And some of the these are some major commonalities. On the other hand, there are specific challenges that we face in different countries on the different conditions. In the case of Myanmar, actually the Myanmar government has limited the how do we say, the internet access to the Rakhine state since pandemic has started with the increase of civil war in Rakhine state. So lack of information has even put more a challenge to the women, where they already have little access to information, being women, and having lack or not having adequate access to the technology or mobile devices. So in the restrictions around internet, banning internet itself put another additional pressure on the women, on frustrations and without having information around this, as well as the limitations on the humanitarian aids in Rakhine state, in addition to the existing restrictions. So during the COVID-19 period, it's become extremely challenging for the women to have access to maternal health care, sexual and reproductive health during in the time of pandemic. One other major challenge that women in IDP, internally displaced person camps in Sidwe, have faced was the additional requirement for permission to go to the hospital, which is outside of the camps, which is far from the camps. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the security forces and the police put additional restrictions and even extortions for receiving those permission to go to see doctors in the case of maternal health emergency cases. So the restrictions through, in addition to these COVID-19 challenges, restrictions from the government on different level put them in a more vulnerable situations. In Bangladesh refugee camps, people in Bangladesh refugee camps and in Malaysia and even in some cases in Thailand, refugee were dense populated refugee were seen as a threat to the spreading the COVID-19, and refugee were scapegoated, and there has been the hate campaigns against the refugees in those places. So in the case of Bangladesh, it's been there has been very little access to information for women, again, because the refugees in Bangladesh are living in very, very dire conditions, and only few women have access to technology, access to telephone, mobile devices, and therefore it's become extremely difficult for them to receive information in the initial or early stage of the COVID-19. And again, in Bangladesh, it's the same, like similar situations like in Myanmar. The Bangladesh Authority has reduced internet access, internet services from 3G to 2G. So it's another level of barrier or obstacle for the women in Bangladesh. And so another however, it's just give me 1 second. So women in Bangladesh have been one other aspect that I want to bring up here is the patriarchal and conservative society that we lived in Bangladesh refugee camps. So when information's COVID-19 awareness were provided by the male NGO workers or the mainly male actors in the refugee camps, it's become again another challenges for the women to access to this information. So what happened was that the NGOs started to realize this dynamic, and they started to empower women to be able to raise awareness within the women population. So and they started to train the women in the refugee camps, and the women were, although they were not able to gather within their women-friendly space, many women actually took initiative and provided information or awareness raising to fellow other women. Initially, it was extremely hard. However, because of this, what I'm trying to say is the gender dynamic and social stigma, as well as the patriarchy among the society, play a key factor for the women to even receive the informations and healthcare. And there has been report of women not being able to access to the healthcare due to the COVID restrictions, not only in Rakhine State for the institutional barrier, but also the COVID restrictions itself has put more difficult for the women to access to other healthcare in camps and refugee camps in Bangladesh. In many cases, the women were misinformed about the COVID-19, and thus consequently women were afraid to report even if they are infected by the COVID-19. In one case, a woman did not report to the healthcare provider, or did not have access to inform about her health conditions, and family were not aware of whether it is COVID-19 or not. She was basically saying she has a heart problem, and then when she passes, people realize it was the COVID-19. So a lot of these misinformations, the stereotype, gender stigma, and patriarchy have played a prominent role here. In Malaysia, the women there are different situations, because in Malaysia, most displaced persons and most refugees live in the residential area. What happened is when COVID-19 hit, people weren't able to, their family members or their husband can't go to the work anymore. And again, hate campaign against the refugees are there. And in many cases, a lot of them, like if the women are widows or a single mother, in that case, it's become very challenging for even pay the rent for the rent. And one major obstacle is that, yes, they have to find NGOs and activists and people, sympathizer, to help them pay rent, and it was extremely difficult. And one other difficult challenge was that whether for seeking help for their rental payment or their food security, or even for access to healthcare, in seeking any kind of this support, the infrastructure that available in Malaysia is not female friendly. So basically, NGOs and religious institutions and everything from hospital to all of these, the infrastructures are not female friendly. Thus, women are not able easily access to this infrastructure or seeking help. And another one is the language barrier. In Malaysia, it's the refugee might not speak Malaysian language, especially the women, and it's become hard for them to seek how to say the help for the refugee women. And in Thailand, There has been report of women not being able to go to the hospital, and delayed women died after arriving hospital because of the delayed procedures. The current women organization has documented some of these challenges that they face, in addition to the domestic violence and other challenges that they face, and information awareness rate, the access to technology, and again, the access to healthcare become a major part of their challenges. So these challenges has not been addressed well, and what we have realized is that when COVID-19 hit, many NGOs and INGOs shut down their operations or left the areas. In that situations, it was the local communities, like the refugee themselves and displaced person themselves, who responded, take initiative in most cases, or in some cases, to respond to the pandemic. So in this scenario, women are become the first responder, or in many cases, women take their own initiative while they're not equipped by the outsiders, or with resources and with funding. They took their own voluntary initiative. Some women established women's organizations. They provided door-to-door awareness to the essential kits for the fellow women. KWO, Korean Women Organization, has provided support to the refugee women in Thailand, and Rohingya Women Development Network in Thailand has provided some assistance to the refugee women in Malaysia, as well as local Rohingya refugee women in Bangladesh has provided some support to the refugee women. And my organization, Women's Peace Network, has actually, we're not a humanitarian provider, but through our partners and friends, we came to identify some most vulnerable women in the camp. So we provided 11,000 women support with essential kits and nutrition support. So that's how local groups and local individuals and women's groups try to respond to the situations. In some cases, it's very nice to see that women started to make money out of the COVID-19 by making masks. So they set up their own businesses, and they sell masks to fellow women and fellow refugee community, while they know how to sew. And so in the case of Bangladesh, refugee women, some refugee women's group support received some small support from the UN Women and other organizations. So they were able to build a business, and they were able to respond to, build a business out of the COVID-19, and that has been incredible to see. So there has been some positive note, and some of the women's group become leaders, become more playing more vital roles in these responses, and their role become more critical. So to be conclude, what need to be done. I think what we have, something that I'm missing in this situation since the pandemic has hit over a year now. It's an impact on the long-term impact on the COVID on the women. So I do think more research on the long-term impact it's needed. For instance, many women workers in Thailand has lost their job, and many of them have been deported to Myanmar. So what happened, how they are struggling with their life has to be studied. And mental health support for the mental health and psychosocial support for the women is essential. Thirdly, I'm going to be very quick. Thirdly, the support funding for the local women's groups and local organizations are essential so that they can sustain themselves, they can respond by themselves when INGOs and NGOs had to leave the area. And support for the more support for the gender-based violence is essential. And lastly, supporting women for their economic small businesses, micro businesses, to be able to identify their talent and interest and to be able to sustain themselves. And lastly, creating infrastructures and institutions women-friendly so that women can access to this help and support and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wai Wai, for drawing our attention to the material and embodied impacts that COVID-19 and specifically countries' responses to the pandemic, which is varied, but also has some important common themes that you've pointed to in Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. These impacts have been undeniably gendered. I'm going to begin the moderated discussion with a few questions before opening things up to participants. Wai Wai, you explained how women have lost income and access to community space, that this has impacted women's ability to communicate with other women and to gain access to valuable information that is not available on the internet. Many people know that domestic violence and maternal health is decreasing around the world. Could you say more about how these elements are interconnected, the loss of household income, the lack of access to women-friendly spaces where women can talk to each other and share information, and maternal health, especially for refugee and displaced women?
I think I was muted. So I have not seen the research on this particular issues, and I can just anecdotally explain how might it affect the women in refugee camps. I think it would increase all these combinations of all this effect would increase the mental health of will affect the mental health of the women in general, and it would eventually, create more fatality among the women. And I think it's hard to say how the impact would effect will be exactly will happen. That's why I said I think it is important that we study this issues more thoroughly. Otherwise, what I'm seeing in the camps is, as I said, increasing mental health, increasing health problem for the women, and again, not only increasing health issues, but also depriving the health care, and that would result more death for the women, especially in the refugee camps. So, that is what we can overall we're seeing the patterns, but it's hard to prove at this point, hard to say what actually happened or would happen.
Absolutely. I think that calls for increased collaborative research that is informed by women's everyday lives on the ground is absolutely necessary. The next question that I have thinks about the policy implications of the expertise that you're sharing. So what would COVID recovery policies and safety net programs look like in your imagination if they were focused on gender equity and on the meaningful inclusion of the needs and participation of refugee and displaced women? And so taking gender equality and equity as the starting point for our COVID recovery.
So I think, what in some cases, in cases in Bangladesh, the approaches from some NGOs has been very effective, basically in their employment, in their resources allocations and support, providing support to the local groups. The having gender equity policy is extremely effective. So as I said, initial responses were mostly led by the male. But then when women were equipped with the resources, they were able to take a leadership and take a critical role and become leaders in the society. So I think institutional policies by the INGO, from the funding allocations from the UN, from the government to the distributions on the ground, should be gender sensitive and should adopt this gender equity policy. At the same time, having more affirmative approach for gender equity is critical, especially during the COVID recovery period. As we see, women are equipped with the resources, they can come up with their own business idea, their own initiative. Thus, it will give them power in the society, in the families. So in addition to the employment, in addition to the funding, donations, funding for the social work, but also economic support for the economic recovery, and providing more support and more funding for the women to be able to do their businesses is key in terms of recovery. I think COVID-19 is a period and a time to reflect all of this dynamic and reset in a way that would bring more equity to the world and to our society, especially in where the societies, the communities are more conservative due to the result of conflict or many other factors. So in this scenario, I think it is a chance for the world to build gender equity and equality by providing more access, making in women-friendly programs or institutions and infrastructure, as well as providing with more funding and more support.
Thank you, Wai Wai. And we have a question. I'd like to ask a question from the participants in today's keynote. We have Yasmin Abdul Razak, who has written, "Hi, Malaysian here. I remember the horrible backlash against refugees when COVID-19 began. My question is, how do we begin to shift a host country or society's perspective on refugees to build a more inclusive and welcoming community?" An excellent question. Thank you, Yasmin.
Yeah, I think it is an excellent question, and it was disheartening to see how refugees were scapegoated in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, and in Thailand. The Rohingya, particularly Rohingya, were targeted. It's been disheartening, and it's extremely sad to see a couple of months and online hate and social media. And I think what we can do is we need more champion, more responsible people like you and many others to basically tell the stories of refugees. And they are just human beings like you and me, right? We need to show the human faces of the refugee. They are not just refugees, they are human. From the first place, they need everything that you need, and they feel everything that you feel. So we need to show the human faces of refugee, not seeing them as refugee or as a threat, and engaging with them and raising awareness about them, I think will fill the gap. At the same time, if there are other actors involved, like government policies or other external actors involved in this narrative, and we need to be able to identify those, and we need to be able to tackle those external factors that increases the hate and prejudice against the refugees.
Absolutely. This past 2 days, we've had a workshop focused on the same questions as your keynote. And one of the themes that came up was drawing from the experiences and context of Malaysia and the racist backlash against Rohingya and Myanmar Muslim refugees in particular. Nur Syazwani Jamuddin, who is in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, spoke about the specific context, and we agreed that the context in Malaysia is such that racialized anxiety over rightful ownership of the economy that dates back decades is a really important context that is generating and continuing to generate backlash against asylum seekers, and especially the realm of work that is very tragic. And so I wonder what you think about, something like your campaign, which was very successful in Myanmar with Women's Peace Network, the #MyFriend campaign, that addresses some of the racial, colonial, and economic structures that are continuing to shape the gendered impacts of COVID-19.
Absolutely. I think, when we look at the context, oftentimes we find there are external actors or governments involvement, one directly or indirectly. In the case of Myanmar, it's government itself involved in promoting this hate narrative against the certain populations, marginalized populations, and in most cases, those countries are, mostly authoritarian countries, or pseudo democracy. I mean, it can even happen in the democratic country as well, right? But these undemocratic countries are more easy to exploit people mindset. Like it's easier to exploit people mindset and promote this narrative than in the democratic countries, although the actors, the leaders might have a similar visions. So I think holding the leaders accountable is one way, holding this, as I said, being able to identify where this narrative coming from and holding these individuals or institutions or leaders accountable is one way. At the same time, promoting human rights educations among the host communities and the refugees are important. And in those society, in like, let's say in Bangladesh or even in Malaysia, I think awareness around human rights and human dignity is very, very low, because in our region, it's whether if we name that democracy, the system as a democracy or not, the human values are very lesser than other part of the world, and the divisions across the ethnicity, racial line or religious line is quite high over there, right? So it's extremely lack of human rights awareness and education is part of the problem, and the leaderships and institutional problem is another problem. So promoting human rights education and awareness is one way. On the other hand, you can promote you can do interfaith work, or you can promote like social campaign, just like we did in Myanmar. We were not able to when the for instance clearance operations against Rohingya happened. We were not able to promote human rights education. So it was human rights, even the word human rights was extremely unpopular. So we have to find ways creatively to be able to educate people that people who are different from you is not a threat. We can be friends and we can live together through this My Friend campaign or social media campaign. Although we don't name it as a human rights, but we use the existence, human connections and human relationship overcome or to fight against this prejudice and hate. So there are several ways that you can use, but to overcome from it. But what is more important is to hit the core and the causes, the sources of this hate and narrative is essential. At the same time, I think in terms of promoting human rights awareness and appreciations of human rights and dignity, human dignity, being human is a must in all contexts, everywhere, even here in the United States or elsewhere. So it's a must thing to be continuously able to do. Otherwise, we will face many other challenges in this world, and we won't be able to overcome from many conflicts and hate and prejudices.
Absolutely. And, thinking about that, we have another really good question from an audience member who is looking for even more concrete steps that, as a foreigner and outsider, what do you recommend that concerned outsiders could do to support refugees and fight against the injustices that you're describing?
So I think there are many, many ways that you can support the refugees and in overall support to the refugees or a COVID-specific support. You can raise funding, and you can raise fund and provide donations for the specific needs, whether on the COVID-19 or in the case of Rohingya right now, the fire victims, over 50,000 fire victims are in need of essential support. And you can do fundraising by yourself and try to find organizations there or individuals there, provide them with support. One thing that I wanted to mention in my keynote, in my remark earlier, was that unlike here in United States or in developed country, the refugee and displaced women, when they lost their job or their income, there is no stimulus package, almost no stimulus package or cash support. So, we need to see how they are doing with this, without any penny. So I think, this is a critical question. While you have government can provide stimulus package, but for refugees and IDPs, they have no such thing. It is a privilege here, right? How do you address these things is I think all of us in individual responsibility to think about and to be able to support the refugees. And otherwise, you can go to those places if the borders open and volunteer with them, or join organizations working for the refugees and volunteer with them, provide your time, your skills, and your energy with us. And you can always contact me if you want to have more ideas how to support, and you can of course come and volunteer with us too.
I can attest from personal experience that volunteering for Women's Peace Network is a fantastic experience. And Wai Wai has also assembled quite a talented team of lawyers through one of her other initiatives, and a legal defense in Myanmar, which I think is another really key way that she's serving displaced women, that you're serving, as I talk to the invisible audience out there, that you're serving women in very both materially immediate ways, but also in ways that are transforming the legal structures. I think some of your other work that I found especially compelling has to do with a project we talked about several years ago, I think, with the ways that international maritime law are gendered, and how I imagine, have specific and new implications. You had identified some very pressing concerns for displaced women and those who are fleeing by boat, and how these laws were gendered. And as people continue to either be on the move newly during COVID-19 or locked in place, that the gendering of these international laws is going to continue to be a concern. And so we have another question from an attendee asking you to expand upon and clarify a little bit about what you mean by women-friendly policies. Just like, this example of the maritime and international ship laws, which in my mind, I think about piracy and the wild west waters of the international sea. But I wonder if you might give some other examples of the gendered women-friendly policies that you see being a sort of solution to policies that don't serve women, that continually marginalize displaced women in particular.
Yeah. So, based on my experience working with the women and in this human rights field for over the past 10 years and talking to many refugee women, I find that, from the policy level to the implementation level and the many levels, I would say, it's highly patriarchal and exclude women in many ways. Like, for instance, what you were describing earlier, Shay, on the law of the sea, it doesn't reflect what the current women victims on the Andaman Sea or other elsewhere, women fleeing from the boat, and it doesn't provide any protections to these women. The laws and the policies did not designed to protect women of sexual violence or other crimes on the sea. So it's become extremely harder for the women to have access to justice on the crimes that they face as they were fleeing. And so, this is one example. So the policies, even by the UN, even by the biggest institutions in the world, has to be reviewed in a more gender sensitive manner that provide more support to the women's access to justice or, protections. And that's one example. On the other hand, even the relocations of funding, the Secretary General UN has been, really good in terms of, being gender sensitive and promoting gender equality, but it has to go through nitty-gritty part of every single policies and institutions across the country, across the world, and that is required. Still, it seems like the current Secretary General of the UN has visions to promote the gender equality. He's been doing it, but it's not really reflecting much on the ground in terms of implementations level. So that has to be reviewed and pay more attention to it. And when I talk about women-friendly spaces or women-friendly infrastructures and places, in the case of Malaysia or elsewhere, it's like basically employment of more women in the NGO sector or in the religious institutions where women need women are going to seek for assistance for their rent or for their healthcare to share their challenges. If they, mostly in most countries, actually, NGOs are led by mostly men. There are only few women NGO, right? So, and they are very, they lack resources. In most cases, they don't have enough resources. So when women try to seek support, it's become another barrier for them to go and talk to this male. It's unlike in the United States, you go and talk to a man. In some environment or society, it's not okay. Women don't just go and talk to a man when a receptionist might be a man, right? They don't go and talk to them just like that. It's the context, a contextual understanding of the specific situations and cities or environment is essential, and creating the women-friendly infrastructures in women-friendly spaces and women-friendly channels are essential so that women feel more comfortable to go and seek assistance or help and opportunities. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like in a more religious conservative society, women might not just call, might not be able to just call and seek assistance, and even they might not even have a phone to call and seek assistance. And if they call, if a man is answering, they're not going to talk to them. Or if they go and seek help, and if they see a man, they might turn away. They might feel intimidated. Well, these are like very, like, I guess, technical and very detail-oriented situation that we need to pay attention to.
That's a really key point, and there's some exciting work in the Weissman School of Design here at Penn, led by Franca Trebbiano, and it's examining the built environment and the ways in which organization of migrants, refugees, and undocumented people is also, reflected in unfree labor dynamics, and how space itself, as you're really cogently describing, is imbued with these social codes that are amenable and convenient for some people, often men, and racial people who are in the racial ethnic majority, and not for women. And so finding a way to engage in social transformation through the built environment, through collaboration with architects, collaboration with geographers. Not that I'm biased as a geographer, but this is, a really important point that you bring up, especially when women's dignity is tied up in who they're talking to.
Yeah, I mean, even in the case of like access to justice, women does not find the existing institutions and infrastructure as friendly as it's supposed to be, because oftentimes the police stations or other available justice mechanism, domestic justice mechanisms, or the informal justice mechanisms within the systems are not women friendly. For instance, in police stations, it's mostly male police. When they go and seek help, they would immediately see a policeman rather than a policewoman. And in the informal structures, like head of the village or head of the camps or head of their quarters are mostly men. Like in Bangladesh refugee camps, we have only a handful of women majis or camp leaders, right? Mostly it's men. So when they have challenges, they might not be able to tell their story and seek or complain their problems in the case of domestic violence or other forms of violence. And it's extremely difficult for women to have access to justice. So what I'm saying is this is another example. This is not just about access to justice. It's about access to education, access to healthcare, access to housing, access to employment opportunity or other economic opportunity. It's all a fact, because the infrastructures and institutions that are available are highly, male oriented.
Absolutely. And, pivoting sort of back to the ongoing pandemic and its gendered implications for displaced women, I would like to ask a final question in our last couple minutes about how, as the vaccine rollout is beginning and is stalled in countries around the world, we already know that. And we already know that vaccines, there are global inequities in the distribution of vaccines. Once poorer and formerly colonized countries do gain access to vaccines, what do you see as a couple necessary steps at the international and at the national scale that will ensure that women refugees are not left behind, especially as they often work inside the home and are made invisible by national policies?
I think it is a very technical questions that the providers, support provider, vaccines providers, and the NGOs, the coordinators on the ground, who are going to be in charge of the vaccine processes, have to come up along with in coordinations globally, and it's very possible. It's very possible that women will be left behind if they're not going to doors, or if they make the access to the vaccines difficult. in most cases, it will be only men going out there and get vaccines. And it is, I think, door-to-door vaccinations process might be one way to ensure women are not left behind. And also another area that we need to pay attention to is, I think it will be easier for the registered refugee to have access to vaccine. But if the displaced people are unregistered, and it will become extremely challenging for these people to have access to vaccine. In the case if they're unregistered and if they don't have legal document in host countries, and it will be another challenge for them to have access to the vaccine. So I think being able to identify the displaced people who are unregistered, being able to make available for the undocumented refugees and displaced people will be key. And perhaps, as I said, the door-to-door vaccinations program might be more effective in this case. But I think this is a questions that we all have to raise everywhere, and I think people are raising it. But it's extremely important questions we pay attention closely to, and continue to push for it.
Thank you so much, Wai Wai. And with that final word, I'd like to, on behalf of Perry World House and the University of Pennsylvania, thank you so much for this exciting conversation. And I have cherished over the years working with you as a colleague, and look forward to continuing to do so. And I look forward to sharing our forthcoming publication in Gender in Myanmar's Transition that highlights some of the work that you were speaking about at the beginning of your keynote. That was a collaboration, and that is, I think, an exciting contribution to the conversation about Rohingya women's experiences of displacement. And so I'd like to turn things back over to LaShawn. And with that, thank you so much again, Wai Wai.
Thank you so much to Wai Wai Nu for sharing your analysis and expertise and taking the time to join us for this informative discussion today, and to our postdoctoral fellow Shay Friedland for moderating such a provocative discussion. It's clear that we need to use a range of strategies to support the rights and needs of refugee and displaced women during this pandemic, including more women-centered policies and including more investment in female leadership. So a lot more intentionality. It was also heartening to hear how much emphasis Wai Wai Nu put on building direct individual relationships as a core strategy to counter racism, stigma, and dehumanization against refugee and displaced women. Thank you again. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining us today. Be sure to come back on April the 20th, join Perry World House and the Penn Center for the Study of Contemporary China for a fascinating discussion on US-China relations and the Biden administration. A panel of seasoned policymakers and experts will discuss the next 4 years of US foreign policy toward China. Then on April 21st, join us for the program Hard Beats and Soft Power, which will examine how music can promote greater international understanding and advanced diplomacy. We'll drop links to these events in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel, and you can find out all about all the great events we have planned by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll drop links to all of those in the chat as well. Thanks for being here with us today. Until next time, be well.